And I give the floor to the Representative of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this floor. Mr. President, this morning we heard of the grim situation of women and girls in conflict zones by our Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Madam Pramila Patten, which presented to us a grim reminder that it is not good enough to deplore this situation by speeches alone when some of us are supplying arms and ammunition to the very perpetrators of this violence in crass disregard for those underprivileged and lesser women who are subject to the horrors of war and conflict. What an indictment of ourselves. Mr. President, we are mindful of the fact that the UN has adopted international commitments to address gender-related violence in conflict, including UN Security Council Resolution 1960, which provides an accountability system for conflict-related sexual violence, stipulated coordinated and timely action of information on such violence, and calls for countries to establish specific time-bound commitments. Meanwhile, Resolution 2122 sets out the need for humanitarian aid to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health services, including for pregnancies resulting from WIT. Mr. President, we also have the Women's Program on Women, Peace and Security, supports women's engagement in all aspects of peace building towards more inclusive, egalitarian societies that can end gender discrimination and resolve conflict without violence. We train peacekeepers to detect, address and stop conflict-related sexual violence. Other initiatives back justice and security institutions that protect women and girls from violence and discrimination, and public service that are fully responsive to women's needs. Regrettably, with all this, the criminals carry on regardless, while we continue to make lofty speeches. Mr. President, neither has the Resolution 1325 has not been very effective in protecting women in war zones, either from sexual violence, evidence from information we are privy to. The disproportionate impact that armed conflict has had on women and girls highlights all the more the importance of the equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for peace and security. The resolution calls for the protection of women's rights, the prevention of gender-based violence, and the inclusion of women in decision-making processes related to conflict. Mr. President, although significant strides have been made in executing WPS agenda in its 23 years, there exists a wide chasm, I say, that needs to be filled with regard to the core commitments of Resolution 1325. Sexual violence against women and girls in conflict zones is perpetrated with impunity, regardless of such conduct being a grave violation of human rights and a widespread issue that has devastating physical, emotional, and psychological consequences. It's often used as a weapon of war to instill fear, exert power, and destroy communities. With all this staring in our face, we continue to carry on in a state of inertia. Mr. President, efforts to address this issue requires a multifaceted approach, including prevention, protection, prosecution of perpetrators, and the support for survivors as one of urgency. International organizations and governments must play a crucial role in implementing policies and initiatives to combat sexual violence in conflict and provide comprehensive support for survivors who otherwise have no redress against these war crimes. As the Secretary General's annual report on women and peace puts it, experiencing a reversal of the generational gains in women's rights while violent conflicts, military expenditure, military coups, displacements, and hunger continues to increase. Mr. President, a revitalized women, peace and security framework must involve a comprehensive approach aimed at promoting gender equality, protecting the rights of women, and ensuring their meaningful participation in all aspects of peace and security. My delegation believes that any progressive action in this regard must include policy and legal reforms, gender-responsive institutions, women's participation in leadership, gender-sensitive conflict prevention, protection and prevention of violence against women, gender-responsive humanitarian response and recovery, and adequate resources and accountability. Mr. President, a revitalized WPS framework should be based on a holistic and inclusive approach involving the active participation of women's organizations, civil society, and local communities. It should also be aligned with international frameworks such as the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions on women, peace and security to ensure coherence and effectiveness in its implementation and the protection of women and girls in conflict-ridden areas. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Sri Lanka for their statement, and I